The landscape of horror is populated with creatures both fantastic and strange. It's a world of monsters and ghouls that test the limit of what we know to be true and frequently bend the rules of reality itself. From vampires and castles on high to Freddy Krueger and boiler rooms down below, and everything in between, the villains of horror have always represented a savage sense of otherness. And yet, for as otherworldly as they may seem, almost all monsters share a secret, universal truth.
All monsters are human.
The monsters of horror are us. Today, on Gamma Ray, we're looking at one of horror's unspoken truths, that under the surface of even the most macabre of entities, the most frightening creatures of all are people. Since the genre's very beginnings, horror has always served as a dark mirror held up to society, using a sense of subversive otherness to comment on things that would otherwise go unsaid. Horror's ability to use symbolism to dabble in taboo made it a perfect place to have discussions on topics that the world at large would deem improper. For example, when Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, there was an ongoing debate at the time over the emergence of scientific thought in an otherwise church-driven society. These themes of faith versus science and man playing God serve as the driving force of the novel's narrative. And Dr. Frankenstein's creature ends up being a bold commentary on what happens when man dabbles in that which he does not understand. And though Frankenstein's creation is the entity we most frequently refer to as monster, horror critics, scholars, and fans alike seem to unanimously agree that it's the doctor himself that's the true villain of the story. The context of faith and religion aside, Dr. Frankenstein's tale is one of arrogance and avarice. The assumption that he knows better than everyone else, and that he should be allowed to do something simply because he can. It's the kind of monstrous behavior that wicked men have used as an excuse for centuries, exemplified in the classic story of one doctor raising the dead.
Stand.
All throughout history, the genre has relied on analogy and symbolism to expose and critique the very real evil that exists in the world. By placing a black actor in the lead in an era when it was still not frequently done, George Romero's Night of the Living Dead famously served as an analogy for the civil rights movement and the struggles and prejudices inherent therein. Romero subsequently used the Dead series to touch on other cultural issues, including the evils of consumer culture in Dawn of the Dead and the dangers of the military-industrial complex in Day of the Dead. In fact, thanks to Romero's influence, zombies as a trope have served as all sorts of commentary on the human condition, from mob mentality to disease pandemics and beyond. Even in the modern era, horror continues to reflect the social wickedness of its time. In the mid-aughts, torture in the Middle East was prevalent in the news, so it should come as no surprise that movies like Saw and Hostel followed in the wake. Today, movies like the new Suspiria and Halloween speak to internalized and generational trauma, which certainly can be connected to larger discussions happening in the world about victims and survivors of assault. And the one thing all these have in common, they each utilize monsters and fright to represent the evils committed by humanity. At its very core, horror is a commentary on the evils that already exist in our world, represented in often fantastical and frightening ways so that we may critique or expose them, and perhaps gain some catharsis in the process. Even monsters that seem so otherworldly and abstract that they couldn't possibly have a human connection aren't, in fact, tied to our own failings. Take, for example, Godzilla. Nothing remotely human about him, right? Wrong. Godzilla was created as a response to the dropping of atomic weapons on Japan during World War II. Godzilla's very inception was an artistic response to a truly monstrous act, and thus, a monster was born. Even creatures as nebulous as Lovecraft's Cthulhu or the creations of H.R. Geiger serve as portrayals of man's fear of the unknown. Ultimately, there's not a creation in the landscape of fright that doesn't tie back to our own humanity and the things that scare and threaten us. Our monsters, both real and imaginary, are always people because they are born out of our own fear. So, next time you're alone on a dark, rainy night and you're feeling a little spooked, maybe take a long look in the mirror, because the thing you might be most afraid of is you. For all the latest episodes, subscribe to Gamma Ray and make sure to tell us your favorite tales of human-driven horror. I'm Suzanne Kiley, and this is Dissecting Fear.